kind of want to say that the big part of the independent Texas spirit side of this festival, when we were considering films, and I was like, Spencer Williams, he came to Texas to make these films, and it's just, that's showing independent Texas spirit. Even though he wasn't Texan, and I don't really know all of that story, but I just got this book.
There you go. Yeah.
So, anyway, I want to talk to you about what you know of his films and them coming to SMU. What brought them to SMU?
Well, it is a long kind of circuitous story, like a lot of stories about film preservation and preservation of other historical works and documents and so on. A lot of times, more often than we'd like to believe, it's just the result of almost happenstance.
Right.
That someone has this or that collection of documents or papers that someone had, or films in this case, and they call an institution, a library, a museum, and say, and this is exactly what Bill Jones experienced, they said, we've got these films, they're in a warehouse in Tyler, they take up a ton of space. I understand you collect old films. If you want them, you can have them. If you don't, they're going in the trash.
Going in the trash.
And that happened a lot. And so Bill said, I want them. And so he got a truck, and they drove out to Tyler. And apparently what had happened, there was a regional film distribution office in Dallas. And what used to happen in those days, in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, is that prints would go out from the studios to local markets, to distribution centers, and a lot of times they didn't necessarily go back to the studios, and the studios didn't want them back per se because it was kind of an expense. The prints were heavy and bulky, and they were considered to essentially have been no longer having any aftermarket value.
Because they thought they weren't going to be shown again.
Absolutely. I tell this to students, and I say, you have to, it's impossible for you to understand, but the reality is, until the late 1950s, when television became more and more prominent, most movies were never seen again after they played off their last runs, in their original run. Some big movies like, Gone with the Wind and Casablanca and King Kong and some of Chaplin's films, because Chaplin controlled them. Mm-hmm. Those were re-released at different points. But the rank and file movies absolutely were not. And you just that's one of the reasons that there was so little interest in film preservation, was because from the studio standpoint, they had zero aftermarket value. So what has survived, it's in almost every case, it's quite miraculous. One of the really terrifying stories for me is that Universal had kept all of their silent library, and Universal is one of the pioneer Hollywood film companies. They had kept all of their silent films on nitrate stock until 1968.
Whoa.
They'd kept them all. And suddenly, there's a vast amount of stuff that was flammable, it's dangerous. They junked it in 1968, which was unfortunately just as film preservation was kind of starting to take hold internationally in an important way. So that's why, for example, there's like 3 or 4 of John Ford's 2 and 3 reel westerns, which were made at Universal between 1917 and 1921. There's about 3 not complete westerns that John Ford made, but they were all there until 1968. And then fires, again, because nitrate was highly flammable. There's stories all over the world. Sweden actually lost virtually all of their film archive. Around 1940, there was a gigantic fire and explosion, and gone. And the stuff that does survive, it's remarkable that it does. And that's a long academic prelude to saying these fly-by-night films made by small companies outside of Hollywood that were producing race movies, it's even more miraculous that any of this material survives. Yeah. Actually around the late 1960s, the Library of Congress Motion Picture Recorded Sound Division, which had I think a different name then, started collecting some of these films because they were recognizing, against the backdrop of the civil rights movement and rising black consciousness, that these films were valuable. And so they had started collecting them. But up until, by the race movies, as they were called, it was the industry trade, were produced from about 1916 to around the early 1950s. And I think it's very comparable, or at least very analogous, to this happens virtually at the same point, say, for example, that the military is desegregated by executive order by Harry Truman, and Jackie Robinson joins Major League Baseball. And so when Jackie Robinson and then other players started playing in the major leagues, the old Negro National Leagues went extinct, essentially. And once more and more black actors, not a lot, but a steady amount of black actors start to work in a variety of roles in Hollywood and movies and television. There starts to be kind of civil rights related movies in certain ways. Then those race movies went away. Because Hollywood had, quote, been integrated. Well, it hadn't been integrated much, but compared to where it was even 5 to 10 years earlier, it was a lot. So Spencer Williams is working between 1940 and about 1946 here in Dallas for an independent niche producer whose name was Alfred Sack. And Alfred Sack was essentially way outside of Hollywood, and there were 2 or 3 other major companies that produced the race movies. They were almost all of them were essentially white owned by the sound period. There had been some black owned companies in the 1910s and 20s. The transition to sound and the fact that there was so much difficulty getting these films made and distributed, those people like Oscar Micheaux, who's the most famous of the early African American filmmakers. Oscar Micheaux has to essentially partner with a white company around 1930 or so to start, 31 or so, to start continue making films. So Alfred Sack is this white producer here in Dallas. He's making small, kind of what were actually called exploitation films, and the actual definition of the word exploitation film in terms of the industry is that this is a movie that's very low budget, that has no stars, that has no real big production values, and what it has instead, the exploitation means advertising and promotion. Mm-hmm. It means hype. I think we're probably most familiar today with like, for example, Roger Corman and AIP in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, which I love. I grew up watching those films in the 60s and 70s and write about them and talk about them all the time. But the term exploitation movie is very different, and it just meant these movies that were based on essentially a selling point in some way. So in this case, some of the very first films there was an African-American company. There were 2 brothers in Los Angeles, George and Noble Johnson, and they formed a company in 1916 called the Lincoln Motion Picture Company, and it was a completely black-owned, and they made and run company. Noble Johnson was the actor, and his brother George was the producer-director. Noble Johnson left the company after a few years and went to work in Hollywood. So he played bit parts or small parts, supporting roles, usually of dark-skinned, non-white characters in Hollywood movies in the 1930s and 40s. His most famous role is the island chief in King Kong. Mm-hmm. Okay. So that's Noble Johnson. But if you think about this image of here in 1916, 17, he and his brother are like among the first, really. They were before Oscar Micheaux. They're the very first African Americans making movies. And then 15 plus years later, his most famous movie is The Island Chief in King Kong. And so there's just an incredible disparity there. So anyway, then by around the late 1930s, the race movies, as they're called, these black audience films is what critics tend to call them today, are steadily being produced, but they're still made in a kind of happenstance fashion. It's estimated that there's only there were about 200 titles made from 1916 to the early 1950s. Yeah. Most of those films were short subjects. They were variety subjects. They were musical performances and dance. We have quite a few of those represented in the SMU collection. Some of them were comedy shorts. Some of them were documentaries. So they made feature-length films, but there were not very many when it's all said and done. And it was not like a regular output whereby the big Hollywood studios in 1935 are turning out collectively 700 feature films a year.
Yeah.
Right, so this is nothing
Right.
like that. Yeah, it was very, very small.
And I want to put into context what Spencer Williams was dealing with, because he had from what I understand, he had a full black cast. He had a almost full behind the scenes crew of black crew, except for the cinematographer and the editor. And from what I understand, the cinematographer had to be white in order to get the film ends from other cinematographers, so other white cinematographers, to send him the film ends that they did not use in their film. So if you think about it, they are piecing together these, ends that are, short ends, really short ends, to go on to, one reel. And so to think about that and put it into context, that when you're seeing this film, the Blood of Jesus especially, there's really only one, maybe two takes of a scene. And so thinking about that and, really saying, okay, how many takes do they make of regular films, of non-black films, non-race films? They would have the over-the-shoulder shot, the medium shot, the long shot, everything. And so I think that it's really important to put yourself in, watching it and with that thought in mind.
One of the challenges of getting interested in the race movies, that's one of the challenges, and a lot of people say this, is this incredibly variable acting performances in the film. Because for the most part, in a lot of films, they would have one or two pretty good actors. Spencer Williams often appeared in his own films. He was the director. He often appeared in supporting parts in his own films because he was a professional actor. And what could often happen, and so some of the people are, someone who starred in church pageants, someone who sang in a choir, or someone who was in a band or something, or someone who said, oh, I think, she's really got talent. Let's put her in this movie. And maybe she did and maybe she didn't. So there's a real kind of adjustment that has to take place in sort of experiencing this, again, highly variable amount of quality of acting. What is really great, that I think one of the reasons that Spencer Williams put himself in his films is because he's doing on-screen coaching. That as a professional actor he had a good deal of natural talent, and he had worked in Hollywood in bit parts, and he had done other things. You can see him sort of carrying people who aren't really actors through scenes. And I think that's partly accounts for why he was frequently playing supporting parts in his films. But again, you're exactly right. They had very, very low shooting ratios, and because they just didn't have the money at the time. And also, this particular person, you might do 17 takes, and boy, they're not going to get a lot better. They're just not. And some will, but you don't have time you don't have the money to do that.
And, with all of that in mind, the Library of Congress chose the Blood of Jesus for their national registry, which is for culturally significant films. They pick 25 films a year, and this one was the first Texas film chosen in 1991, when it had just come to SMU, like in the late 80s.
Or the early 80s. Right?
Early 80s, okay.
Yeah.
And so just thinking about, that was 50 years later, and hardly anybody had seen it since 1941. Mm-hmm. And so and the cool thing about this is that during the Dallas International Film Festival this year, there was a short film that played there that we're so lucky to be playing it before the before Blood of Jesus, and it is it's a narrative, and it's showing the behind the scenes of what it took on one shoot to make this film, and it's beautiful. It's called The Making of a Classic, and so we'll have that film, we'll have The Blood of Jesus, and then we're going to have a panel with Rick and with Elizabeth Hansen. Elizabeth is the managing director of the Texas Archives of the Moving Image, which is also known as TAMI, and it's texasarchives.org, I believe. And so to talk about film preservation, to talk about the archives, to talk about why this is important, why we need to have this, and we need to be able to see it. And for TAMI, they also take home movies, and so they'll have, and they love to see, like your grandparents' home movies, because it really shows how people dressed, what how they walked, because most of those are silent. Those are going to be silent films, but we can really see a lot of just natural, normal people, and going to the beach or going to the park.
Those kind of amateur films, a lot of historians and archivists started getting, probably about 25 years ago or so, started getting really interested in those films. And very often, a lot of times, this was literally the origin, this whole principle was literally the origin of found footage, that people would literally turn up these reels like at a pawn shop, or it would be at an auction, of someone's possessions, that an estate sale, and maybe it had passed through multiple generations and no one knew what to do with it, but it's the same thing. Do we throw this out or do we keep it?
Yeah.
And again, you're exactly right. It's a really fascinating source of all kinds of sort of social history and cultural history.
Yeah, and these are in our backyard, which is, so important. Yeah, Dev.
So The Blood of Jesus, do we know where this film was filmed? Because I've seen a lot of conflicting information online, but do we know where any of this was filmed?
Well, I know for sure where some of it was. One scene is filmed. There's an opening. It's the St. Paul's Methodist Church downtown, which is right beside the Booker T. Washington High School. So there's a couple of shots of exterior shots of that church. And I was on a panel talking with some other scholars about 10 or 15 years ago, and there was a young woman in Austin who was a graduate student, and she had tried to contact them and find out about their involvement in the church. Well, that church had a fire in like the 1950s or something like that, and they'd lost a ton of records. So So, again, was there something there, some correspondence? Even a few thank you notes or something, in that case. But it seems to have been largely shot in the Dallas area. Alfred Sack worked here into the 1970s. And in fact, from what I've been able to learn and talk to other people, he was such a kind of, niche exploitation film producer that when the race movies ended after World War II in the 50s, he started making sort of movies for drive-ins, low budget movies, including softcore porn, for sort of sexy movies that played in the drive-ins, because that was where that was essentially the business he was in, which is he was an exploitation filmmaker. So.
The other thing that really jumps out at me, and I don't know if you could talk about this, is that The Blood of Jesus has a full soundtrack, which was that unique to race films back then? Because I've seen other race films where they don't really have a robust soundtrack, but this film does. This film has almost 12 tracks to it.
It's that film has been cleaned up quite a bit too, and again, one of the problems, they weren't making this at 20th Century Fox or MGM, right? And so they had pretty simple kinds of tracks and equipment, but again, you're right. I think that you can hear what's going on here pretty well much of the time, and sometimes there's like gaps in these movies that there's just like nothing, no sound for 10 seconds. It seems like there's no ambient sound even or anything.
And the soundtrack is really robust as well.
Yeah, and
is that pretty unique to that time?
Well, again, I think one of the things that's in terms of especially if you're talking about music,
Yeah.
one of the things that the race movies are also, I think, really interesting for is that they would get these local bands and musical acts or church choirs in this case and record them. Mm-hmm. And again, this isn't when you hear like these jazz bands or small kind of club bands and so on, this isn't Duke Ellington and Count Basie, right? Mm-hmm. This is not a national act of super professional musicians. These are like regional musicians, essentially, and local who are working professional musicians in a kind of hard scrabble life. And that's fascinating that we've got these sort of vaudeville acts of dancers and comedians and so on preserved who would otherwise be completely lost to us. And music, again, the church choirs and other things. And it's really fascinating for that reason. Yeah.
Well, we need to wrap it up if there's not another thought.
I just have one question.
Okay.
You said that there was a truckload of film that was picked up in Tyler.
Tyler,
So
yeah.
how many actual films did you wound?
You know, I think the answer is something like about 60. But now, of that number, most were Hollywood films. Most of these were nitrate prints of Hollywood movies
I didn't know
that existed elsewhere. So I think of the actual race movie titles, shorts, and features, it's about 16 or 18, something like that.
How did the treasure trove you got though?
It is, and
Yeah.
it's a treasure trove in the sense of it was a fairly representative collection of these movies. And again, I think the reason that they were all in one place was because, one, there weren't very many of these movies total, and the fact that this distributor had, well, here's all this stuff, and they would recycle these prints. They would go out again and again. And they would also do these things where I've seen this 2 or 3 times where there's a pre-existing movie that they pad out with new musical numbers. So there's the one race movie that's about World War II is originally called Marching On. And it's really interesting because it's about this young guy who really, it doesn't get it articulated, but it's clearly the underlying message is, why should I go fight for the white man? You know, what did the Japanese do to me, right? And that no one says that,
Right.
but it's pretty clear that his grandfather, who fought in the Spanish-American War, who was in the 10th Cavalry with Buffalo Soldiers and so on, wants him to join the army. And eventually they do. He does. But anyway, so a couple of years later, 2 or 3 years later, Alfred Sack went back, shot some musical nightclub footage of singers and dancers in a band, cut it into the movie, and you're watching this movie that's probably only about 55 minutes long, and they padded it out with 15 minutes of music. And so now it's a new movie, and you release it with a new title, send it back out again.
That sounds really cool.
Yeah.
I think that the Tyler collection also is where we get, I think, Juke Joint,
Yeah.
Gurdy Gurdy from Harlem,
Right.
Go Down Dead, show
All the Spencer Williams titles,
almost
yeah.
every Spencer Williams did. And Gurdy Gurdy from Harlem, which I have a copy of, I think is the most polished looking book, comparatively speaking.
Yeah.
It looks the most like a Hollywood movie, because it was a remake of a Hollywood movie.
Yeah.
That Joe Crawford movie.
Right, The Rain.
An official remake.
Right.
And the other thing I noticed is because of the way they were making those movies, they were not bound by the Hays Code.
Oh, no, not at all.
And some of
Not
the
at all.
musical and dance numbers they would never have gotten away with
Right.
in a Hollywood.
I love that.
Absolutely, you're exactly right. You see more sort of skin and sexual provocativeness in those movies than absolutely you wouldn't have seen in the 30s and 40s in Hollywood. And actually, I will plug somebody else's thing here, but there's a wonderful collection of these movies that was done about 5 years ago that's called Pioneers of African American Cinema. It's on Blu-ray and DVD. It's also available for streaming, and you can see this really excellent collection of so many of these movies, Oscar Micheaux and Spencer Williams and other producers. And 2 of SMU's titles are on there, The Blood of Jesus and Dirty Gurdy from Harlem, USA, which Gordon mentioned. And I think you're exactly right, Gordon. I think that was Dirty Gurdy was one of the later movies that he directed. And again, it stands to reason. He'd made 5 or 6 movies. He got better at it.
Yeah.
And, it's just, it is a pretty polished movie all around. I agree. And there's really nice versions of both Blood of Jesus and Dirty Gurdy on that collection.
Are all these feature-length movies, or are they shorts?
Both. Blood of Jesus is a short feature. These are really equivalent to Hollywood B films or programmers in the 1930s and 40s. And if you think that, Bs were designed to play on double bills, and so they're only about an hour, basically, kind of plus or minus a few minutes, and that's really what these movies are in terms of length for the most part. And some of the Oscar Michaud films are a little bit longer and not necessarily better as a result of that, as far as I'm concerned. Most people tend to say that Oscar Michaud's silent films, of which we have an incomplete record, are kind of more interesting than his sound films. The film Within Our Gates from 1919 is incredible. An incredible movie. It involves a lynching, depiction of a lynching. This is like 4 years after Birth of a Nation, and it's a really important movie.
Well, thank you so much for
thank
being
you.
here with us. I really appreciate it.
I appreciate it. I'm looking forward to showing the film.
Yeah.